Welcome to the presentation on modern art. Now, after the influences of the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and all the changes that happened at the end of the 19th century, art in the 20th century moved further away from representation as artists explored new ways of expressing themselves. In this module, we will look at some of the art of the very first half of the 20th century. As we learn the motivation and the influences of these artists, their work can take on a deeper meaning. Because this is such a broad topic, truly we could spend a whole semester on modern art. We're going to look here at some of the main influences of this time. The painting to the left is by the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, who's featured in one of this week's movies. She painted this picture of a favorite tree after laying under its branches for several evenings. She says that this painting can be looked at from any direction. Georgia O'Keeffe is a great example of an artist whose work is somewhere between representation and abstraction, and there's a bit of symbolism in there as well. So let's talk about architecture, shall we? There was some major technical advances that really converged in the early 20th century, and we think about them all together, they're rather extraordinary. We have the airplane, the automobile, the telephone, electricity, motion pictures, and many other advances that were really developed over a rather few years. Think about what life would have been like before all of that, and how extraordinary it must have been in the early part of the century when all these changes converged. The invention of the modern elevator in 1857 made it practical and possible to have taller buildings. There's an architect, Louis Sullivan. Remember, Louis Sullivan developed the technique of making steel frames covered in masonry, which led to the modern skyscraper. So if somebody were to ask you, who really created the modern skyscraper, I'd suggest that you answer with the name Louis Sullivan. Okay, there's a test question for all of those who are listening. This building on the right, built in 1891, is in St. Louis, and it's considered the first modern skyscraper. The department store on the left is the first of its kind to use large display windows, which we might really take for granted, but which were also invented during this time period. Now let's look at a little bit more odd architecture. In Europe, there's a style called Art Nouveau that was developing during the same time period, the early 20th century. In contrast to the streamlined look of the American architecture that we just looked at, this style was based on linear patterns and curves inspired by natural organic shapes. This building to the left is an apartment house in Barcelona built by Antoni Gaudí. Although it appears to be molded, it's actually made of cut stone, designed to appear as a natural form. We call it the ice cream cone building because can't you just see the soft friezes on the roof? To the right is the interior based on an Art Nouveau design. This style of Art Nouveau has also inspired jewelers, artists, and craftsmen of all kinds. These two images reflect Art Nouveau influences. To the left is a drawing by the English artist Aubrey Beardsley, and it was done in 1894. As with the Impressionists, the influence of Japanese prints is evident here in the patterning, in the simple shapes, and in the stylized move away from realism, yet with art that still suggests realism. Now, Aubrey Beardsley died at the young age of 26, but his work is seen as strongly influencing the Art Nouveau style. He was sort of the precursor of the style. Now on the right we have a famous work called The Kiss by Gustav Klimt, and this was painted about 15 years later. Honestly, Gustav Klimt is one of my favorite artists because he was a master at combining realism with abstraction, and he also created very strong emotional pieces with simple statements. This painting above was painted in 1898 by the artist Henri Rousseau. He was a French customs official, and he was really untrained in art, and began painting in middle-aged. His primitive style and images based on dreams strongly influenced Pablo Picasso and surrealist artists such as Salvador Dali and we could say Rene Magritte. All of these artists sought to explore the unconscious parts of the mind, to create fantastic images based on dreams and memories as they moved further away from realism. Now, as we consider the effect of photography, it actually allowed these artists to move away from realism because the camera could handle that. The camera could take a picture, and then the role of the artist was no longer that of one who records reality as we know it. The role of the artist became someone who could explore other aspects of the psyche and create images that represented that. The artist Marc Chagall was a Russian Jew who immigrated to Russia just before the First World War. In this painting, I and the Village, he recreates scenes of his early childhood in Russia and adds scenes from folk tales and symbols from his own unconscious mind. So actually, Marc Chagall left Russia just before the First World War and settled in Europe. So this painting is a fascinating story. It's by the artist, he was an Italian named Giorgio Chirico, and it was painted in Paris in 1940. It's titled Mystery and Melancholy of a Street. And what's fun to notice about this is that it was created just as World War I was about to devastate Europe. And we see a sort of premonition of danger in this imagery. Now later, Chirico could not explain the meaning of the empty moving van, the girl running with the hoop, or the ominous shadow behind the building. And after the war, he returned to Italy and he dismissed his earlier symbolic work as if embarrassed by it. He returned to painting in a more conservative style. But this work of Chirico, especially this kind of surrealist work, was to have a strong influence on the surrealist movement that would develop in the 1920s. As World War I came to a close, young artists began to question the very fundamentals of what art was. Now think about this. These were young men, mostly men, but some women also, who had gone through World War I in their own countries, who had seen towns devastated, who had known about the gas attacks and then the influenza outbreak. So this would profoundly affect a young person, and no doubt it would deeply affect their relationship to life and to what they could believe. So a group called the Dada, who was from this age group, was formed. And Dada actually means baby talk, da, 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 like that. The Dadaists sought to push society's limits. One famous Dada sculpture was presented by Marcel Duchamp, and it's actually a urinal. A urinal, like you would see in the bathroom of the day, and it's presented as a work of art. He signed it with what looks like nail polish with the words R. Mutt, and then he displayed it, and of course it was very scandalous. In the early 1920s, Dadaism had kind of, come to its peak and faded. The same group, the Dadaists, decided to dedicate themselves to an exploration of the unconscious. They were strongly influenced by the writings of Sigmund Freud, and they believed they could create art that bypassed the conscious mind, that they could go directly from the unconscious mind to the canvas. So they wanted to create art that was, to quote them, free from the exercise of reason and from any aesthetic or moral purpose. The artist Salvador Dali was the most famous surrealist. He was very dramatic and lived his life as a surreal expression in general. His piece, The Persistence of Memory, is based on a dream. And to the right is a work by Frida Kahlo, a Mexican artist who created surrealist works. They were haunting self-portraits with surreal imagery. You know, her story is that when she was 17, she was in a bus accident and she was actually impaled. A rod went through her body from the bottom to the top, and she had just 30-something operations. and was not able to walk or stand pain-free for the rest of her life. And so she did these haunting self-portraits that expressed partly what she went through. She was also married to the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, and he is another very famous artist of the period. Let's continue, though, in looking at Surrealism. One of my favorite artists is the Surrealist artist, is the artist Rene Magritte. Instead of going for deep, unconscious revelations, sometimes he just sought to represent the absurd. His work uses images that upset our view of how the world works, and that was really his intention. He wanted to discredit ordinary reality with his imagery and to lead the viewers to what he called the world's mystery. These two examples are only a taste of the large body of delightfully absurd works that this artist, Rene Magritte, created. So now let's look at a totally different school of art from the same time period. So while the Surrealists, they were trying to create work that was free of the rational mind, the Bauhaus school believed in an ideal world, completely run by rational thought. And the Bauhaus school was formed in Germany. It was founded by Walter Gropius, and it sought to reconcile modern art and industry through what he called cultural synthesis. He believed that an artisan should be trained in every aspect of his art. For example, that the architect should fully understand the building process before creating a structure on paper. So maybe that architect would build a house. So Walter Gropius created a school of arts and crafts that taught streamlined design principles and employed many avant-garde artists. Now, why don't you remember, this is a really good idea to remember this, Walter Gropius created a school of arts and crafts. That's a good one to remember for your final exam. Now, this school building pictured above reflects his design ideas, and we really see them in a lot of the architecture of the 1960s that were free of almost any adornment. Now, in 1933, Adolf Hitler closed the school, and many of the artists involved came to the United States. Let's look a bit more at Bauhaus ideas. Here's an interior based on Bauhaus and a factory that reflect the clean, rational look of Bauhaus designs. Now, one of the this is interesting. I like to look at this because honestly, in the interior to the left, it doesn't quite look that warm and inviting to me. It's all rational thought. So while it's a good exploration, I'm not sure if personally I'd want that as my home, but you know, everybody has their opinions. So one of the responses to the technological advances of the time was a belief in a utopian vision of how humans could live. That by using only rational thought, people could create a new kind of world where efficiency would create an ideal civilization. So in other words, if we just get rid of all those messy emotions, well, then we can have an idealized world. Kind of reminds me of the teachings of Plato, actually, who had a lot of the same thought. And in both cases, it proved to be not sustainable. Because, like it or not, I think emotions are part of our human condition. And if you think about art that has a strong emotional content, it is usually very powerful art. But along that idea of the utopian ideal based on the rational mind, hey, let's talk about the futurists. Now, the futurists were another group that came out of this time of great change and conflict. They believed that the faster pace of life had fundamentally altered humankind in a positive way, and that a whole new approach was needed as people would create art that reflected the high speeds now possible. One of the futurists wrote a manifesto which included this passage, that we will glorify, I'm quoting, that we will glorify war, the only true hygiene in the world. We will destroy museums and fight against all utilitarian cowardice. Unfortunately, this helped fascism, which was led by Mussolini in World War II. The sculpture to the right is by Boccioni, And I'm going to end now because we're out of time, and we'll start with part 2.